Good morning, everyone. We're so excited to talk with Dr. Ben Fitzpatrick today about the Cold War and the origins of the Civil Rights Movement. And so we encourage you to turn your cameras on and join us and speak out or put questions in the chat. Most of you, I believe all of you probably know Dr. Fitzpatrick, but he always gives us a phenomenal presentation about history, and we come away knowing so much more than we did before. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll get started. Active agenda is in the chat. Also, there is a sign-in / evaluation, just one form you have to fill out. If you could fill that at the end. Thanks.
All right. Now I can use my presentation?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Okay. So today we'll talk a little bit about World War II and the origins of the civil rights movement. Oftentimes when we think about the civil rights movement, we focus on, the 1950s, the 1960s, and that's that time period. However, I think that coming out of World War II, there's something profound about what the war does to the United States, how it changes the United States image on the international scene, how African Americans began to see themselves and their role in the United States, and it really put an emphasis on furthering the civil rights movement. So as I tell my students, World War II is this profound moment in world history that just has all sorts of implications. And I don't know if there would have been a civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s without World War II. So that's what I want to talk about with today's talk. So 3 questions to think about or organize your notes around. Why did World War II make it untenable for the U.S. government to ignore Jim Crowism after the conflict? How did African Americans use U.S. involvement in World War II to protest against Jim Crowism? And why did the 1948 presidential election mark a major shift in American politics and in the fight for civil rights? Okay. So I want to start us out here with a quote from Malcolm X. So as Malcolm X was getting started with the Nation of Islam in the 1950s, he became kind of like the face, the spokesperson for the movement. So he was doing all these sort of, interviews and talks, and it gives this very interesting observation in his autobiography. So I wanted to start us off with that because I think that this kind of sets the tone for the theme here for my presentation. So he says he was giving a number of interviews with newspapermen, and this is one of the things that he said. The reporters would try their utmost to raise some good white man whom I couldn't refute as such. I'll never forget how one practically lost his voice. He asked me, did I feel any white man had ever done anything for Black men in America? I told him, yes, I can think of 2, Hitler and Stalin. The Black man in America couldn't get a decent factory job until Hitler put so much pressure on the white man. And then Stalin kept up the pressure, end quote. Now, when you first hear that quote, you're like, well, whoa, what exactly is Malcolm X talking about? But the pressure, right, that Malcolm X is talking about, Hitler is putting pressure on the Roosevelt administration, on America to support the British, support the French. And as we'll see here, by the time we get to late September, the late fall of 1940, early 1941, America's moved away from its former stance of neutrality. So there's this pressure, right, that Hitler and the Nazis are putting on the United States, to stop their aggression in Europe. The same thing that's going on in Japan. And then, of course, after the war, we have the Cold War, and Stalin is putting pressure on the United States government to stop the spread of communism, around the world. And in order to do those 2 things, to defeat fascism, defeat communism, the United States needed the support it needed the efforts of African Americans. And so what this did, right, was it opened the door to further Black civil rights. And so that's essentially what I'm going to talk about here. Some of these tactics, some of the groups, and some of the individuals who use that moment to help further African American civil rights and civil rights in general for everyone. But also, there are going to be some kind of concurrent themes to sort of think about, right? So, in order to, I guess you might say, amass Black manpower and woman power, we have this huge movement of African Americans from the South to the North. It's kind of like the second great wave of the Great Migration that's going to begin here in 1940. And we also have this heightened sense of African American consciousness that is coming from their involvement in the United States military, which throughout the war is going to be segregated, but we have people who are attempting to integrate the service. So I think Malcolm X's quote here kind of sets us up for a major theme here. All right, are there any questions? All right. So I want to start out here with our aggressor nation. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about what it was exactly that they wanted, their sort of political philosophy, and also how race played into their kind of overall political goals and imperialism. All right, so let's start here with Japan. And the best way to see Japan is that by the time we get to the 1920s, the Japanese government had been pretty much taken over by what I call ultra nationalists. Most of them were military men, and what they wanted to do was to push Japan onto a path of empire. As I say here, ultra nationalists, they wanted to create what they called the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's just a nice way of saying empire. In fact, they had a name for it, the Imperial Way. I guess a good way to think about this is that many Japanese felt slighted by the West. They felt slighted by the United States. They felt disrespected. Coming out of World War I, Japan considered itself to be the major power in Asia. And they sort of thought, that they would get their divide, their bit of the spoils of the colonial empires, that were being broken up at the end of World War I. So they thought that they would kind of get that. But in fact, they didn't. As a matter of fact, they felt disrespected. For example, around 19, around this, what year is this? Around 1918 or so, they have signed something called the Washington Naval Treaty. And essentially it limited the number of ships that the Japanese could have in the Pacific. And so they just felt like, that they were being hamstrung. They were being treated as a second class country. So that's why you have the rise of these kind of ultra nationalist leaders by the time you get to the 1920s. Now, if you have
there's a question in the chat, Ben.
Yeah.
It says, isn't this the same way Italy felt as well following World War I?
Yes. Actually, yeah, it is this sort of that they felt like they had been slighted. As a matter of fact, Italy changed sides during World War I, if I remember correctly. They start out on the side of Germany and Austria, and they end up changing sides basically to try to get more land, if I remember. But yeah, and particularly in Italy, they were experiencing a depression long before the United States. And so that's kind of how Mussolini came into power, right? He's the guy who's going to solve all their problems, I guess you might say. Yeah. So yeah.
Thank you.
Now here in Japan, you're an island nation, right? And so you have imperial pretensions, that means you've got to go out and conquer territory in order to get those resources that you need to build an empire. Now, in 1931, Japan's going to invade Manchuria, and the Japanese already had some presence there in Manchuria. I'll show you on the map where Manchuria is. It was kind of part of China, but the Japanese already had kind of an interest in it. But in September of 1931, they do this full-scale invasion, and they're going to rename it Manchukuo. They set up a puppet government there, and they began to build railroads, extract oil and coal and tin and all of these resources that they need to become stronger. Now, in the summer of 1937, we have the Japanese and Chinese. They're going to clash at the Marco Polo Bridge. And this is right outside of Beijing. And after this, after 1937, after this battle, the Japanese do a full-scale invasion of China. And so we oftentimes think of, the Nazis invading Poland in 1939, right? That's the beginning of World War II. But if you think about it in this context, Japan's invasion of China in 1937, I mean, that's kind of like the beginning of World War II, really, for the most part. Now, here you can see here on the map, this is Manchuria or Manchukuo. And by the time you get to the 1930s, the Japanese have already, like I said, they've established themselves a little bit here in Manchuria. They've also controlled Korea for the most part. They've defeated the Russians in an earlier war in 1904, 1905 for control of Korea. So, I mean, they were already on the march. So basically, as you can see here from this line, this is going to be their farthest reach here during World War II. But as far as the Japanese are concerned, as kind of slather on top of this whole imperialist ideology, the Japanese believed that they were racially superior to all the people in the Pacific, whether they were Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese. They saw themselves as superior to Europeans, superior to Americans. And so this racial superiority theory that they have, that is going to inform how they conduct the war. And the Japanese perpetrated some of the worst war crimes during World War II. This is an image of the rape of Nanking. Basically, the Japanese army just ran rampant over the city of Nanking in 1937. Hundreds of thousands, 200,000, if I remember correctly, citizens were killed, tens of thousands of women raped. Basically, the way that the Japanese saw battle is that these people were inferior. They were fit to be annihilated, particularly soldiers who surrendered. For the Japanese, surrendering was considered to be dishonorable. And so any enemy soldier that surrendered basically was treated harshly, if not just outright killed. And of course, that's in violation of the Geneva Conventions, which the Japanese basically ignored. But when you think about the Japanese army, I mean, their philosophy of fighting is summed up in a phrase here: kill all, burn all, loot all. That was their philosophy. And so they carried out these types of brutal campaigns throughout the war. And in addition to that, they also carried out the types of what we usually associate with the Nazis, right? Which is the experimentation on prisoners of war or experimentations on civilians. The Japanese also carried that out. They had a unit called Unit 731, and that's all that unit did, was they did these types of experiments on Koreans, on Chinese. They would test out biological weapons. They would do frostbite experiments. I mean, it was very brutal type of war. So,
Dr. Fitzpatrick,
yeah,
there's a question in the chat about, were they ever held responsible for that in terms of war
that's where
crimes?
that's actually where I'm headed.
Okay.
That's actually where I'm headed. So sort of keep in mind here, right, that we've got, this is in many ways this imperial ideology, right, to go out, conquer territory, take resources, have colonies, but slathered on top of this is this racial superiority theory that the Japanese have. All right, yeah, and I'll get to that when I get to the end of this section. All right, any other questions? All right, so the second of our aggressor nations is Germany. And of course, you guys know the basic outlines here of the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. So by 1933, Hitler is going to be named chancellor. And so when you think about the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, it comes out of once again a national resentment of being treated as an inferior. And of course, for the Germans, it's coming out of World War I. The Versailles Treaty, the way that Hitler explains, how Germany is treated, is that it's unfair. And to some degree, some historians would say that perhaps that is true. There was the war guilt clause in the treaty that the Germans essentially agreed to, and it basically blamed them for starting the war, and that's not necessarily true. But the Germans basically were responsible for paying back all these billions of dollars in reparations to France and their allies and so on and so forth. And so Hitler tended to play on that resentment, and of course add into that the mix of the Great Depression, which is that was worldwide. So it wasn't just the United States that was experiencing Great Depression, but also European countries as well. And so Germany was going through hard economic times, and so these things kind of gave rise to Adolf Hitler. The people, they agreed with his message, and of course, slathered on top of this, we have another racial superiority theory, and that is one that the Germans descend from Aryans. They are a master race, and of course, as a part of maintaining their purity, right, they have to get rid of impure people in Germany, and of course, Jews were the primary target of that racism. As you see here, this is a piece of propaganda put out by the Nazis. I don't read German, but the point behind it is that Great Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, who's behind these governments, these corrupt governments? It's the Jews. That's the stereotypical image of the Jew in Germany at this time, right? So that's part of the Nazi propaganda, right? That the Jews are these cabal of wealthy people, devious, who are behind the curtains, pulling the strings, and fomenting disruption and pollution in society, right? Now, in 1935, Hitler starts the rearmament of Germany. Basically, Germany's going to pull out of the League of Nations. They ignored the Versailles Treaty, which essentially said that they had to have only a certain number of soldiers, certain number of tanks, certain number of planes, so on and so forth. Hitler says, no, we're going to start rearming. And of course, this is more than about just trying to rev up the economy. Hitler has designs on retaking what he says is German land occupied by German people, right? They want to become a part of Germany again. And so with his Lebensraum policy, or elbow room, right, Hitler begins to invade parts of Europe. So in 1936, Germany's going to invade the Rhineland. This is a territory between France and Germany. It was supposed to be demilitarized according to the Versailles Treaty, but Hitler says, no, we have Germans who are living there. They want to be a part of of Germany again. In 1938, the Nazis are going to invade Austria. And there was a large population, Germans, who lived there. So Hitler kind of once again makes this argument, these people want to be a part of Germany. Now, also in 1938, we have the Munich Pact. And with the Munich Pact, basically, Europeans are going to turn over Western Czechoslovakia to Hitler and the Nazis. The region was called the Sudetenland. And you guys probably have heard the phrase, you can't appease dictators, right? You can't appease, strong men. This is where this phrase comes from. Essentially, we have Great Britain and France and Italy and Germany. They all met in Munich, Germany, to hammer out this deal. They didn't invite the Czechoslovakians, right? They just kind of gave away the land. Basically, Europeans were willing to do almost anything to avoid war. They were so afraid of having another, coming out of World War I, they were so afraid of having another war, and they were basically willing to give Hitler whatever he wanted. There's this famous picture of the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returning back to London with the Munich Pact, and he says, we've got peace in our time, and it turns out to be a complete disaster. Hitler's going to end up taking the rest of Czechoslovakia a little bit later. Now, a good characteristic here of this kind of slathering of racism and anti-Semitism on this imperialistic philosophy in Germany is the Nuremberg laws. So as the Nazis are coming to power, right, what they begin to do is to create laws that essentially strip the Jews and other, quote, non-Aryans of their citizenship. And the best way to see the Nuremberg laws, really for the most part, they are in many ways related to Jim Crow laws in the American South. I mean, really for the most part. And there are actually historians who've looked at these laws and said, the Nazis did in fact look at how Jim Crow laws were constructed in order to create the Nuremberg laws. So when you look at the Nuremberg laws, they were created in 1935. Nuremberg is a city in Germany. This is where they held these huge Nazi rallies in the city of Nuremberg. You have a picture. So there are kind of like two categories of these laws. So protection of German blood and German honor. And the Nazis were just absolutely obsessed, I guess would be the best word to use. They were obsessed with blood, ancestry. How do you know who's a real German, who's a Jew? And so they come up with all of these categories essentially for how you identify a Jew. They actually created a chart. And so, if you had, I think it was like 3 grandparents who were Jewish, you were Jewish. If you had 2 grandparents who were Jewish, you were half Jewish, and so on and so forth, right? So, but the protection of German blood and German honor, what these laws began to do was try to identify who were Jews and who were non-Aryans by bloodline. Now you also have the second category, which is the Reich citizenship laws. And so, just for example, under these laws, marriage between Jews and non-Jews was outlawed and could be jailed if you married a Jew. Jews couldn't vote, couldn't hold office. And just kind of overall, Jews are prohibited from seeking higher education, owning businesses. I mean, to some degree, they go beyond the Jim Crow laws in that sense. I mean, I guess the difference would be most African Americans were already in the underclass, whereas Jews in Germany, many of them were actually in the middle class and in the upper class. And so basically prohibiting Jews from owning business, from being professors, I mean, that's why Einstein and these other Jewish doctors and professors and scientists were leaving under the Nazis, because basically their livelihoods, their very lives were being extinguished. So in some ways, the Nuremberg laws go further than the Jim Crow laws, but the idea is still the same thing, right? To strip um, what is seen as an inferior people of any sort of rights as citizens. All right. Any questions?
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
Where could we locate? Is that chart something that we could locate and look at?
Yeah, I wasn't. What I saw when doing research is I just saw some pictures. I didn't, like pictures online. I didn't actually see something that you could like print out, but I bet there probably is a primary source that you could access. But I didn't actually find one. I just saw like a picture of the chart, but not the actual chart that you could.
Just thought that would be a really cool primary source document to share with
Yeah.
students.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Now, of course, with what the Nazis are doing, we have the Holocaust, and you guys know the basic structure here of the Holocaust. So I won't spend a whole lot of time with this, but when you think about the Holocaust, these concentration camps, they start in 1941, and I guess kind of the best way to think about this is, right, I mean, the Nazis had every intention of stripping Jews of their citizenship, stripping them of their livelihoods, and I guess when when the war starts here by 1941 or so, they begin to ramp up and come up with this, as Adolf Hitler said, the final solution. Now, the SS, or the Einsatzgruppen, they run the death camps. So basically, as the Nazis go out and take territory, one of the first things that they begin to do in every village, every town, every community they go, is they try to begin to identify who are the Jews in the community. And of course, you have the Nazi secret police, the Gestapo, who work with people in the community and people, law enforcement as well, to identify the Jews. The Jews are rounded up and then sent off to these death camps. And they basically they run these camps. Now, at Auschwitz, just as a good example, you have 1.1 million people who are killed. And so when you think about the concentration camps, there are work camps, and then there are death camps. And Auschwitz is kind of both to a certain degree. Here we see the famous sign, "Our mock free work will make you free." And so, once the Jews are brought in by train, they're unloaded. The SS, they begin to divide folks. Those who are seen as being healthy, who can work, they're sent to one part of the camp. Those that are designated as being too old, too young, too sick, they're sent off immediately to be killed. Now, 6 million Jews are killed during the Holocaust, but we also got to keep in mind here that the Nazis, the list of people that they hated was very long, right? So the list of people that they killed was more than Jews. So communists, gays and lesbians, the mentally challenged, basically all these people are targeted. So 6 million Jews are killed, and maybe 5 or 6 million others are killed during the Holocaust. Now, this takes us to the previous question, which is what happens at the end of the war, right? So as we've seen here, the level of barbarity, the level of just outright murder that was committed by the Japanese army, that was committed by the Nazis, that could not go unaddressed. And so what we have at the end of the war is really kind of the beginning of international law. That would be the best way to think about it. So with the Nazis, we have the Nuremberg trials, and these occur between 1945 and 1949. And so what the Allies decided to do to try the Nazis, and this was actually pretty controversial. And I'm not a lawyer, but essentially what the people who were against this said is, look, as at the time that these acts were committed, they would not have been considered criminal. There was no law in place at that time, right? And so you can't try them for crimes that supposedly didn't exist. But the best way to think about this is that coming out of World War II and seeing all of this horror, I think that most people felt like something had to be done to address this issue, to make sure that it did not happen again, or at least there would be somebody of law that would be able to address it. And so, you know, people want to say, you know, this is just kind of like the victors writing the law, or victors, you know, kind of creating the rules after the war. That's fine, but I think it was definitely something that needed to be done. But basically what the Allies do is they create the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal. And so the Allies begin to set up a court system. Countries like the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, they're going to send judges to the court. You have prosecutors who are from the United States. The defendants have attorneys who are, you know, from the Allied countries as well. So we have defendants that include Nazi party officials, military officials, and even some civilians as well, because during the war we had you know, POWs and also Jews who were treated essentially as slave labor, working not just for the Nazi government, but also for companies that were making, you know, war goods for the Nazi government, for the war effort. Probably one of the most infamous defendants during the trials is this guy here. His name was Hermann Goering. And Goering, during the war, he was the head of the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force. Now he's going to commit suicide during the trials. If I remember correctly, he took a cyanide tablet, so he died before he could be convicted, if I remember correctly. But basically, the defendants are tried on three categories of crimes. It's crimes against peace, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And so the crimes against humanity aspect, this is where civilians are persecuted or killed because of their race or ethnicity, right? So as I say at the end, the trial sets a precedent in international law. There are about 199 defendants or so who are tried. 161 are going to be convicted, and 37 are going to be sentenced to die. Now, in Japan, after the war, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur, he decides to kind of follow the lead here of the Nuremberg trials and set up a similar tribunal. This is called the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals. So 1946 to 1949. Once again, we've got defendants who are Japanese officers, members of the Japanese government, once again, civilians who may have benefited from slave labor. Once again, the Japanese basically did the same thing that the Nazis did, using POWs and civilians as slave labor. With the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, there were, I think there were over like 5,000 or so people who are tried. Some of these are tried in smaller courts as well throughout the Pacific. Now, probably one of the most high-profile defendants in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunals was this guy here, Hideki Tojo. And Tojo, as I say here, he had been the prime minister of Japan from 1941 to 1944. So kind of think of what I said earlier about kind of like the ultra nationalists taking control of Japan, usually military officers, followers of the imperial way. Tojo is definitely the symbol of that. Now, he's going to be tried by the war tribunals, and he's going to be convicted of crimes against humanity, and he's going to be executed by the tribunal.
Ken, would you like to pop on and explain what you put in? Oh, did you just send that to me, or did you mean to send that to everybody? You put something in the chat, the chart. I'm going to share that with everybody.
Did you find the chart?
Found it, and it looks like to me some of those as I was looking as well, it looks like that a lot of those Nuremberg papers are actually at the National Archives or in the American Holocaust Museum. I think you can see the actual chart, but some of the laws themselves are housed at the National Archives. So maybe those are things that we will see when we go to Washington this summer. If you all would like to go with us, sign up if you haven't.
Yeah, the Holocaust Museum is it's one of the most powerful museums I think I've ever been to. Besides the 9/11 museum, that's incredibly moving and powerful. Yeah.
I was just wondering, the gentleman that took the cyanide pill, is there any speculation on how he was able to access that? He was in custody at the time, correct?
Yeah. I don't know how he was able to get it. Maybe I don't know. Maybe a visitor slipped it to him. I don't know how he was able to get it. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. All right. So here with Italy, so Italy's a little different. We don't have this sort of we certainly have the imperialistic aspect of it, right? But we don't have the sort of racist aspect that we find with the Japanese and the Germans. The Italians certainly see themselves, or at least the way Mussolini portrays himself, as the Italians are a dominant people, superior people, kind of once again, who have been they've been kind of stripped of their power here. So as I say here, Mussolini comes to power in 1922. So I mean, he's kind of like the prototype of the fascist dictator. I mean, Adolf Hitler is like looking to Mussolini for like tips. How do you become this powerful fascist leader, right? So Mussolini kind of comes to power here in 1922. So he kind of comes to power as Italy is once again kind of coming out of World War I, stripped of their power. They're suffering through a depression. And Mussolini says, look, I'm the guy that can solve our problems. I'm going to return Italy, to its days when it was the Roman Empire, right? So he says, Italy will once again control the Mediterranean Sea, our sea. Now, for the most part, when you think about Italy, they are the weakest here of the Axis powers. But the connection here with African Americans is in 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia. Now, the reason why they did this is that Ethiopia had at one part in the late 1800s been a part of Italy's colonial empire, but they had broken away. And so Mussolini says, look, we're going to get back this piece of the Roman Empire, and they invade in 1935. And of course, things did not go very well for the Ethiopians. You had the League of Nations, but the League of Nations really they didn't do anything to help the Ethiopians. And so they were kind of at the Italians' mercy. Now, what this does do in the United States is it begins, as I say here, spark outrage among many African Americans, particularly who are living in larger cities who can get organized. There is something called the Ethiopian World Federation that's created in 1935, 1936. Basically, you have African Americans who come together to protest Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. They begin to raise money to try to help support Ethiopians, but basically that's it. It's really kind of this protest organization. but it does kind of spark this consciousness among many African Americans, about this type of racism and type of colonialism that is occurring. Now, Mussolini, there's not going to be any sort of tribunals for the Italians. Mussolini's going to get he's going to get his at the end of the war in 1945. He's executed by Italian partisans. They basically capture him and they execute him and his mistress. But my main point here with this first part of the presentation is coming out of World War II. The United States has fought against fascism. It's fought against Japanese imperialism in the Pacific. The liberation of the concentration camps, the liberation of Asian countries from the Japanese and the type of atrocities they are committing. Now the United States has to confront this racism kind of head on, particularly since it is now helping to create international law, right, that is making these types of behaviors, even in wartime, criminal. So now the United States is coming onto the international stage in a way that it hadn't been before. And this is going to basically force the United States government to, you can't turn a blind eye to, Jim Crowism and the racism that's going on in America if you are presenting yourself as defending democracy, equality on the international scene, if that makes sense. All right. The next piece here, what I want to talk about is some examples here of the WWII campaign, and you guys may already be familiar with this event. But I want to use some examples about the WWII campaign, about how African Americans are using this moment to kind of further the civil rights movement, and also talk a little bit about some of the involvement of African Americans in the war effort, right? Okay. So the WWII campaign, this is essentially a slogan that came about by 1940 or so, that African Americans were using to promote civil rights. So essentially what WWII means is that African Americans were willing to go overseas and fight the Nazis, fight the Japanese. They were willing to do their part in the war effort. But they were also going to fight for their rights and fight against Jim Crowism at home. It was hypocritical to go overseas and fight for the liberty and the democracy in a foreign land when you were not given those same rights here at home. So that's basically what the WWII means, right? African Americans are going to fight for victory overseas, but they're also going to fight for victory at home. So by the time we get to late 1940, early 1941, the United States has moved away from its neutrality stance. So in the 1930s, as it looked like we're on the verge here of another world war, the United States began to pass a series of neutrality acts, which basically were meant to keep the United States out of another world war. Well, by the time you get to late 1940, early 1941, the United States is doing things like the Lend-Lease program, where President Roosevelt, under this Lend-Lease law, can lend or lease military goods to Great Britain or any other country that he feels supports the United States security, right? So what we have here are African Americans who begin to support something called the March on Washington movement. And I'll talk a little bit about the gentleman who was behind this. His name was A. Philip Randolph. But basically, the supporters of the March on Washington movement saw this as a moment to get President Roosevelt to begin to support African American rights. So basically what supporters said is, look, we want the federal government to prevent companies that are getting government contracts, that are making the tanks, making the planes, making the guns. They're getting these government contracts. We want the government to outlaw discrimination within the defense industry. And, if we don't get this, basically, we're going to have a march on Washington. And the numbers rise. First, people say, look, we're going to have 10,000 people who show up. And then it's going to be, 50,000 people. Then it's going to be 100,000 people, right? Now, as you can imagine, having this type of protest as the United States is ramping up for war, I mean, that would have been embarrassing. And so the pressure of the March on Washington movement does work a little bit. They get kind of the first piece of what they want. So in June of 1941, to head off to prevent a march on Washington, FDR issues Executive Order 8802. Now, basically what this did was it outlawed discrimination in the defense industries. So you gotta sort of keep in mind here that what gets America out of the Great Depression is World War II. That's unfortunately, but that's the truth. So as the government starts to spend all of this money on defense, it just supercharges the economy. And so, you've got places like, Mobile, Alabama, that becomes the center of, shipbuilding, and cities in Michigan, Detroit, that are making airplanes and tanks. And so, all of this money is being pumped in to these communities and revamping the communities. And so basically what the executive order said is that these defense companies, companies that are getting defense contracts, they cannot discriminate when it comes to hiring. Now, to help support the executive order, the federal government creates something called the Fair Employment Practices Committee. And the job of the committee is to investigate any complaints that folks have about being discriminated against by these industries. And really, for the most part, we are going to have more and more African Americans who are going to find themselves in the defense industries. But there are still going to be certain jobs, particularly in the South, where Blacks just only maybe a handful of them will be able to, say, get a job like a welder, say, down at the Mobile shipyards. Most of them are not going to be able to become welders because the white workers, they protest. And so we do have more and more African Americans who are going to get involved in the defense industry, but there are still some certain jobs within these industries that Black people have a really hard time breaking into, even though they're supposed to be, a watchdog committee here. Now, the guy who is behind the March on Washington movement, his name is A. Philip Randolph. And some historians essentially kind of consider Randolph to be kind of like the godfather of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And it is this March on Washington is one of the reasons. We usually associate the March on Washington with, Dr. King in the 1963, but the idea for this came from A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph had a very long history of social activism. He actually started out as a labor organizer. He was a socialist. He was a member of the Socialist Party. He ran as a candidate for the Socialist Party in New York state politics. He never won office, but he's probably most noted for being the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. So if you don't know what a sleeping car porter was, back before there were planes, right? People traveled across the country before there were airplanes, people traveled across country on trains, right? And so trains had sleeping cars. They were called Pullman cars. And porters were, for the most part, African-American men. They basically looked after the customers, right? So they would bring on their luggage, they would bring them drinks, whatever they needed. And actually, that was considered to be a really good job for African-American men. I mean, these porters were kind of like in the middle class as far as the African-American community. So around 1925 or so, Randolph becomes the president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he's going to turn this into a major labor union for African Americans. Now, he plans the first march on Washington in 1941. So he's the one here who's putting pressure on President Roosevelt to do more for African American rights. Another thing that he wanted was to get Roosevelt to desegregate the United States military. Now, Roosevelt was not willing to go that far. He does give some sort of token demonstrations. For example, I'll talk about this just a second, but he promotes Benjamin O. Davis Sr. to Brigadier General, the highest ranking Black officer, but he really has no authority over white troops or anything like that. So basically, that was about as far as Roosevelt was willing to go as far as integrating the military, right? Now, in 1963, Philip Randolph, he's going to organize that march on Washington. So he was still around in the 50s and 60s as a part of the movement. Now, there were many African-American newspapers during this period, maybe 200 or so. So when you think about the promotion of the WWII campaign, African-American newspapers would have been crucial to this. And there are many of them, probably one of the most important, and the one that kind of puts the phrase WWII out there in the public, although I don't necessarily say that they coined it, but they definitely made it popular. They started to use it as the slogan, was the Pittsburgh Courier. If I remember correctly, I think one of their writers wrote them a letter, and they used the WWII in their letter. And after that, the Pittsburgh Courier like, oh, that's pretty good. So basically, they started using it as well. So the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier is this gentleman here. His name is Robert Lee Vann. He was an attorney as well as a newspaper editor. And so when you think about, some organizations that are promoting the WWII, trying to put pressure on the government to do more for Black civil rights, African-American newspapers were at the forefront of that. And as I said, there are about maybe 200 or 250 of them or so. Now, we also have some of our older civil rights organizations that are pushing the WWII, and we also have kind of a new kind of growing cadre of African-American politicians that are also pushing the WWII. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that here. So this is Walter White here on the left, and he was the leader of the NAACP during World War II. And Walter White, so when you think about what the NAACP is doing, White is out there, talking to the public once again, trying to put pressure on the federal government to integrate the United States military, deal with discrimination in the defense industry. Then they're also taking on some court cases trying to challenge Jim Crowism. So they're kind of doing a more traditional, kind of the traditional roles that we think of with civil rights organizations. And as I'll talk about here in a minute, there are new organizations that are coming about during the war, and they're different than some of these old organizations, particularly with their tactics. Okay. Now, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., he's got this new cadre of African-American politicians that are coming about. He's a Democrat. He's going to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives around 1940. And he comes out of Harlem. He was a Baptist minister. So he basically represents the Harlem region of New York City. And he is he's actually the first, I think he's the first African-American politician elected from New York and really from the Northeast. And so here you have this guy who is a Democrat who's trying to battle it out against the southern wing of his party, which are deep segregationists. So, you would have had Adam Clayton Powell, kind of this, this lone Black voice within the Democratic Party, supporting integration. So we've got, older civil rights organizations that are pushing the double V, and we've got new cadres of African-American politicians that are pushing for the double V. Now, we also have African Americans who are involved in the defense industry. And of course, we have African American men who were involved, but we also have what I call her Black Rosie. So we usually think of Rosie the Riveter, right? The the white woman who has gone to work to build the ships, build the airplanes. But there were about 600,000 or so Black women who were involved in the defense industry. So this is important, and it kind of helps to explain how we're getting this new rise of African American politicians like Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Right. So beginning around 1940, and really ending around 1970 or so, we get this second wave of the Great Migration. So we've got African Americans who are leaving the South, and they're going to cities in the North, and they're also going out west as well during this period. And they're trying to take advantage of the rise in the defense industry. There are job openings. So you have African Americans who are moving away from agricultural work and domestic work, and now they're moving into industry. So we would have found thousands of Black women who were working in the defense industry. Now, once again, as I said previously, some of these positions may have been closed off to Black women, or there was only a certain quota of Black women who could be welders or so on and so forth. But this is important, this shift in population, not only for the war effort. Let me show you here on this map. This is also important because what's going to happen here, as more and more and more African Americans move to the North, that is going to build political power for African Americans. I mean, that's why we're able to, elect someone like Adam Clayton Powell Jr. As the African American population grows in the North and the West, they are able to vote. They don't have the same sort of voting restrictions like we have down here in the South. As far as Jim Crow laws are concerned. And so this is going to be important by the time we get to the end of the war, and it's going to help to explain why Truman and at least Northern Democrats have to respond to the civil rights movement in the way that they do, because this shift in population is not only fueling the war effort, but it's also going to fuel Black political power, if that makes sense. And here's another example of an individual who is supporting the Double V campaign, Mabel Keaton Stoppers. And Mabel Keaton Stoppers, she was the director of an organization called the National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. The National Association of Colored Graduate Nurses. And so basically what Stoppers was trying to do was to integrate the Army and the Navy's nursing corps. And there's actually this big push by African-American doctors and African-American nurses to try to integrate the military first, like even before you get to combat soldiers. I mean, there's this push, and in particular, by the time you get to 44 or 45 or so, the Army had a shortage of nurses. I mean, they were actually talking about drafting nurses into the Army. I mean, they so low, but they refused to allow African American nurses to treat white soldiers, except POWs. You could have found Black nurses tending to German POWs, but Black nurses were not allowed to tend to white soldiers. And so Mabel Keaton Stoppers, basically she created kind of considered to be a coalition of Black doctors, white doctors, Black nurses, white nurses, women's organizations. She even was able to get the support of Eleanor Roosevelt to try to push the War Department to allow more Black women into the Army and nursing corps. And eventually she's able to do that, but they still were not able to attend to white soldiers. They were still put in segregated facilities, but she is able towards the end of the war to get the War Department to increase, basically allow more women into the Army and Navy nursing corps. Oh yeah, here's a good example of of an organization. This is a Black organization of Black doctors. It's called the Journal of the National Medical Association. This is its journal. So we have Dr. John A. Kinney, who says, "It is very likely that a white soldier lying on the battlefield, writhing in pain and his blood ebbing away, would object to having his pains relieved by a Negro doctor. My answer is not very likely. Then why, in the interest of this democracy, does the War Department find it necessary to segregate Negro professional services to members of their own race?" So once again, here, a good example of African-American doctors who are trying to push the federal government to integrate. And of course, this isn't going to happen until after the war. We're not going to get a fully integrated military until after the war. So some examples here of African-American participation during the war. Now, really for the most part, when you think about the role of African-American soldiers during World War II, at least towards the beginning of the war, African-American soldiers are treated as really kind of second-class soldiers. They're basically kind of around to do the dirty work, to do non-combat roles. And this comes from, unfortunately, a long history of treating African American soldiers as inferiors in the United States military. Now, to give you an example here of how African American soldiers were viewed by the military, the American War College study, and I gave a link to this, and you guys can read some of the excerpts. But this was a study that was conducted in 1925. And essentially, it characterized African-American soldiers as cowards. They were, not fit to serve in any sort of combat role. Negro officers should not be allowed to, should definitely not be allowed to command white troops, so on and so forth. You guys can read the link here. But the point here is that this War College study basically ignored hundreds of years of history of African Americans serving bravely and serving well. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters that fought during World War I. They won all sorts of medals. African American soldiers during World War I, they fought before white soldiers did. So basically, this War College study really, it was the predetermined answer that most of the white establishment in the military wanted, basically ignored everything. So by mid-1940s, African Americans are going to begin serving in combat units, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. So as the war kind of drags on, more and more manpower is needed, plus that pressure that's being put on by WWII activists, it tends to have its effects as well. So by the time we get to 1943, 44, we're going to start seeing African Americans in combat. So we have nearly 1 million Blacks serving in segregated and mostly non-combat units during World War II. Now, this picture here is of Dory Miller, and Dory Miller, probably one of the most famous of the African American servicemen during World War II. If I remember correctly, he was on a ship during Pearl Harbor, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he was a messmate. Basically, he was a cook at the time. And when the Japanese attacked, he basically ran on deck and took control of an anti-aircraft gun and basically began to shoot down Japanese Zeros, and he ends up winning a medal for his actions, and the U.S. Navy sends him back home and kind of uses him as to raise support among African Americans. And eventually, he's going to get killed during the war. His ship is attacked by the Japanese. But guys like Dory Miller, I mean, they proved that African American men could, even without training, essentially, because I don't think he got training on that gun since he was a messmate, could act valiantly during combat. Now, another good example is the Red Ball Express. And the Red Ball Express essentially was a transportation unit. So after the D-Day landings, you've got the Army now that is on the move, right, to reach Germany. Well, the question then becomes, how are you going to resupply those soldiers? They're so far away, right, from the Normandy coast. Well, this is where the Red Ball Express comes in. So these transportation units were put together. Some of the drivers were white, but by far most of them were African Americans. And the Red Ball, it gets its name from trains that were basically traveled at high speeds. They were unimpeded by certain railroads. They could basically travel unimpeded. So that's where the Red Ball Express comes from. But basically, these truck drivers were traveling, hundreds of miles to take, food, fuel, ammunition, whatever was needed to keep the war effort going. I mean, so they're traveling into, German territory, and they're being shot at and being fired at by planes. And so the Red Ball Express was incredibly important for maintaining that momentum after the D-Day invasions. Now, of course, you guys have all heard of the Tuskegee Airmen. And so when you think about the Tuskegee Airmen, they are the first African Americans to actually see combat, and this could be around 1943 or so. And so when you think about the Tuskegee Airmen, they are a good example, I think, of how the WWII campaign is putting pressure on the government to at least use African American men more productively, or to use them in combat. So the unit is going to be formed in January of 1941, and an air base is created at the Tuskegee Institute down in Alabama. And the airmen, they're going to participate in campaigns, as I say, here in North Africa, Italy, Germany. They were essentially what they called a pursuit unit, or a fighter unit. And so they're attacking German fortifications or Italian fortifications on the ground. They're also guarding U.S. bombers. I forget how many missions, just hundreds of missions that these guys flew protecting U.S. bombers, and they never lost one bomber, not one, throughout their time. So they were a pretty amazing unit. Now here we have the 761st Tank Regiment, also known as the Black Panthers. And so this is where the phrase the Black Panthers come from. They wore a patch on their shoulder, the Black Panther. Their motto was "Come Out Fighting." And the Black Panthers, they see action in 1944 and 45. They're fighting with George Patton's Third Army, Battle of the Bulge, for example. So we have African American men who are fighting in the ground forces and infantry as well. Now, there are African American officers in the military during this period, but really, for the most part, when you think about these segregated units, they have kind of lower Black officers, like lieutenants, things along those lines. But the officers were usually white. So say like with the Black Panthers, they would have had, lieutenants, for example, who were African American. Give you an example, Jackie Robinson, right? A baseball player. right? So before he integrated baseball, he was fighting against Jim Crowism in the Army. That was actually his old unit, the 761st. He was a lieutenant, but he's not going to be able to go with them. If you guys remember the story, Jackie Robinson basically got on a bus at an Army camp, and he was told to go sit in the back. He refused to give up his seat, and he ends up getting court-martialed. So when the war, he's not found not guilty, but he ends up being court-martialed. Basically, that whole trial basically kept him out of, kept him from going to Europe with the Black Panthers. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the Black Panthers would have had Black officers who were lieutenants and things like that, but their main officer, the colonel, whatever, was white. Now we do have some Black officers of note here. So this is Benjamin O. Davis Sr., and this is Benjamin O. Davis Jr., right, his son. So Benjamin O. Davis Sr. had a very long history in the military, going back, gosh, to the 1890s. he actually fought in let's see, the Spanish-American War, the Filipino-American War. He had a very long history. Basically, what his connection here with World War II is around 1940. President Roosevelt promotes him to brigadier general, and he does that out of the pressure that's being brought to bear by A. Philip Randolph and the March on Washington movement. So basically, it was kind of a way of saying, okay, I'm going to promote Davis here. He's already a high-ranking officer, but he becomes the first African-American brigadier general. But really, for the most part, during the war, he's just kind of serving. I would characterize it as just sort of a symbol. He really has no command over white troops. They basically put him in these positions where he was, an advisor to the Secretary of War on Negro troops, or something where he was just kind of this symbolic figure. He never really had authority over white troops. Now, his son, on the other hand, is going to be the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. So, unlike some of these other units, the Tuskegee Airmen actually had high-ranking African American officers. He was a colonel during the war. He was the leader of the Tuskegee Airmen. After the war, when the Air Force is created, he's going to become a general in the Air Force.
Yeah, a quick one. I was wondering if you had any information on Colonel Charles Young.
Oh, what kind of information?
Well, I guess I'm in the wrong.
I think what is
here. I think Charles Young was in the First World War, but all I know is he is the first. I don't know if he was the first Black colonel or first Black officer, and he happens to be from Mayslick, Kentucky.
Yeah, I think he's the first. I think he's the first African American colonel in the Army, the first to reach that level. I think I want to say he's the third, or is it the second Black graduate from West Point?
Okay, that sounds familiar.
But yeah, he basically wanted to command a unit. Since he was a colonel, he wanted to command a unit during World War I, and the Army just refused to send him because they didn't want him commanding white troops. And I guess at that level, he would have been in that command. He would have been in that position, because even during World War I, those units, they're segregated, but their top commanders were white, so they didn't want to put him there. If I remember correctly, Young did, in some ways here, tutor or mentor, I guess would be the best word, mentor Benjamin O. Davis Sr. He was actually his commanding officer at some point. So he was like his mentor. So he would have been, they would have, known each other, and Davis would have worked under Young.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Mhm. All right. And the last category here is the WACs. And so we have African American women who are serving in the WAC. And the WAC, basically, this is the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And we would have found white women serving in the WAC as well. And so the best way to think of the WAC here is, I guess, the way that they would have been characterized by the military, right, is to release a man for combat. So basically, the WAC took up roles like clerical jobs, switchboard operator, radio operator, mail clerks, air traffic controllers, right? So basically, the goal here of the WAC was to have women do jobs that would free up men for combat. And so we have African American women who are part of the WAC, and once again, they're serving in segregated units, but fulfilling these important auxiliary roles. So this takes me to the piece here of some new organizations that are coming about during this period who are introducing some new tactics that are going to become important later on here in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in particular, what we see here in the 1940s is the use of nonviolent resistance. So one of the new civil rights organizations that's going to come about during the war is the Congress of Racial Equality. This forms in 1942 in Chicago. One of the founders is this gentleman here in the middle. His name is James Farmer. And when you think about CORE, they are maybe a little bit different in some ways from some of the older organizations, in the sense that they are interracial. That's not to say that some of those older organizations were not. I mean, some of the original founders of the NAACP were white. But when it comes to the actual sort of like activity, the organizing, the going out and promoting and fighting for justice. I mean, you have whites who are involved in CORE as well, and I'll show you guys an example of that. So it's interracial, more interracial in its nature, perhaps, than some of these older civil rights organizations. Also, Farmer and CORE, they support a more direct action sort of approach. So with older organizations like the NAACP, for example, right? I mean, they've got their own, wing as far as legal defense fund, right? So they're trying cases in court. But with CORE, what they're probably more interested in is going out and kind of directly confronting racism and using civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. Now, to give you an example of that, in 1947, there's something called the Journey of Reconciliation. It's put on by CORE. Okay. So once again, you see my example here of an interracial organization. And so what CORE decided to do was they were going to see if the federal government would support their right to ride integrated busing interstate. So basically, southern states, their bus terminals were segregated, right? There's a section in the terminal for white riders, there's a section for black riders. And then, of course, when you load on the buses, blacks sit in the back, whites sit in the front. Well, what these CORE activists decided to do was to ride integrated to see if they would be able to do that, see if the federal government would stand up for their rights. This is different than what we see later on with the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders basically rode through the Deep South. These folks don't even get out of Virginia, if I remember correctly, before they're arrested by local authorities for breaking segregation laws. But the point here is that in the 1960s, right, we're going to have the Freedom Riders in 1961. They're basically going to use this same tactic, but of course, there's going to be in the Deep South, and it's going to be much more violent than this one, the reaction that they get. Now, one of the leaders of CORE and one of the main promoters of nonviolent civil disobedience into the 1950s and 1960s is this gentleman here, Bayard Rustin. I can turn back here and show this is Rustin here. He was a part of the journey of reconciliation. And he's also one of the co-founders of CORE along with Farmer. And so Rustin, he's going to become the primary strategist of nonviolent resistance in the 1950s and the 1960s. As a matter of fact, he's the one who primarily advised Dr. King on using that strategy. So just kind of a little bit here about Rustin. He was a pacifist, kind of came out of a Quaker background. As I say here, he served 3 years in prison for resisting the draft during World War II. He actually, I think he was actually in prison over in the federal prison in Ashland. But basically the way that Rustin saw it is that, you know, lawsuits were fine and public protests were fine, but you had to in some way sort of directly confront these immoral and unjust laws, even if it meant that you went to jail. And by going to jail, I mean, you are essentially, you know, you're highlighting the injustice of the law. And so Rustin becomes a major promoter of this. And as I say here, he later goes on to advise Dr. King throughout the movement to use nonviolent civil disobedience. And initially, you know, when Dr. King comes onto the scenes during the Montgomery bus boycotts, he's not quite so sure that nonviolent civil disobedience is the way to go. But Rustin later convinces him. Rustin also helps to organize the March on Washington in 1963. Now, I think that we oftentimes don't think about Rustin. In fact, he's probably not talked that much about regarding the civil rights movement. And the reason why is that he was kind of pushed to the side, pushed to the back by King and others, and it was because he was gay. And there were people in the movement who told Dr. King, you know, we don't want Rustin to be the face of the movement. We don't want people who you know, want to bring the movement down, like you know, Dig or Hoover and the FBI for one, that might try to use Rustin against the movement. And there were people in the movement who, you know, they were prejudiced against gay people as well, who didn't want Rustin to take a lead. But he was an important mind and important organizer of the movement.
One quick question: the role that the war played in terms of the African American population in Europe when they come back from the war, I guess the different way they were treated in Europe during the war opposed to how they'd been treated, especially in the South prior to the war, the role that played in pushing the movement forward. Or do you see that connection?
Sure. I mean, you would have had U.S. servicemen who came back from the war who would have been treated differently in Britain, different in France. Now, that's not to say that they would have been, but that there was like no prejudice in Great Britain or France. I mean, after all, these were, you know, colonial powers. I mean, they had their own racism and bigotry. But I think that there was, particularly in Great Britain, more acceptance of African American soldiers, and you are going to see this push from African American veterans, you know, for equality. So yeah, I mean that time definitely affected you know, the impetus, the flow of the movement.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right, so this takes me to the last piece here, and that's Harry Truman and the election of 1948. So Truman, he's going to lead the country through World War II after Roosevelt dies in April 45. And so what we get here with Truman is kind of a revision to a certain degree of the Democratic Party's role, their connection with civil rights, but also the federal government's role, their connection with civil rights, okay? So in 1948, Truman, he's going to run on something called the Fair Deal, Basically, this is his version of the New Deal. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but a piece here of it is support for civil rights. Truman, even though he was a Southerner, came out of the state of Missouri, he in many ways shared some of these prejudices that many white Americans did. He believed that it was important that the United States begin to support civil rights and trying to make America a more equal society, particularly here in the early stages of the Cold War. And I'll talk about how he's doing that. Also, as part of the Fair Deal, he wants to expand government programs that have been created during the New Deal. Now, Truman, he's opposed by many Republicans, and most oppose him because of the New Deal. I think that what we can say here about the Republicans, many of them do support civil rights legislation. They support making America a more equal society. Many of them are Northerners, by the way. So we don't really have a great deal of support for the Republican Party in the South at this point. Now, so the Democrats, they oppose the Fair Deal, essentially because of Truman's support for civil rights. So what we've got here is a Democratic Party that's split, right? So we've got Northern Democrats who support the civil rights plank of the Fair Deal, while Southern Democrats, they oppose it. Now, I'll come back to that in just a second. Now, around 1946, what Truman does is he establishes something called the President's Committee on Civil Rights. It's called the President's Committee on Civil Rights. He creates this in 1946. And what he tasked this committee with doing is to go out and investigate civil rights in America. Okay, so what is it exactly, committee, that we can do to support civil rights, that we can further democracy in America? Okay, so in 1948, this committee is going to come back. They're going to publish their findings, and it's going to put a document called "To Secure These Rights." And I give you guys a link to this document. And the committee comes up with all sorts of findings, and they make all sorts of recommendations. So they recommend getting rid of poll taxes, for example, integrating schools, passing a federal anti-lynching law, which we just now did that a few months ago, right? But basically, they have all of these proposals that they say can further rights in America. Now, one of the things that they propose is to integrate the United States military. Now, Truman is going to take the lead on this. In July of 1948, he issues Executive Order 9981. And it was actually drafted by Walter White, the guy that I mentioned previously, who was the head of the NAACP during this time period. He actually drafts that executive order, and then changes were made to it. But he was a big part of that. And so we're not going to have a fully integrated military until the Korean War, so 1950 or so. But I mean, this probably would not have happened, right, without World War II, without the WWII campaign. All of this integration would not have been possible. So as I say here, my last part here, kind of see 1948, it's a watershed in American politics, because what we see is the Democratic Party, this party which had in support of Jim Crowism, it's now beginning to push against it and turn against it. And I think that for Truman, let's turn back to the map here real quick. And I think for Truman, I think that he probably was kind of able to see kind of the writing on the wall here, as far as trying to keep supporting Jim Crowism. Just wasn't going to fly in a world where the Cold War was beginning to happen. So you got to sort of keep in mind here that the Soviets, we're not quite there yet, but even the Chinese, once they become a communist country, I mean, they used segregation in America as a part of their propaganda campaigns. I mean, they try to use it against the United States. So I mean, what America is trying to do is to win allies in the Cold War, and you can't do that, right? If you're supporting Jim Crowism and you're trying to win over countries in Asia, Asia and Africa. So in that sense, and also in the sense, as we've already seen, we have African Americans who are moving to the North. They're able to vote. They're becoming an important voting bloc. And so you have to appeal to those African American voters as well. So I think that Truman and many Democrats kind of saw the writing on the wall here as far as this old sort of political system. So looking at the election map here of 1948, we've got Truman, Thomas Dewey running for the Republicans. We've got Henry Wallace running for the Progressives, and Henry Wallace would have been considered like the ultimate New Dealer. I guess you might say he would have been to the left of Truman, right? But the important one here is this candidate, Strom Thurmond, who's running for the States' Rights Party, or the Dixiecrats, as you guys have probably heard them called. So basically, what we have here is the Democratic Party that splits because of Truman's support for civil rights. Basically, Strom Thurmond and these Southern Democrats said, no, we're not going to vote for Truman and his civil rights platform. And notice, they're winning South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. So 1948 kind of see this as the year that the Solid South begins to break up. They're not. We're going to see, into the 50s, Southern states are voting for Eisenhower. And by the time you get to, Nixon, the South is turning red in the late 60s, early 70s, as the Republicans begin to take up those disaffected Southern Democrats. So the election of 1948, as I said here, kind of see it as a watershed year when it comes to American politics. So my takeaways here: America's new role as an international leader made defending racism untenable in the post-war world. A variety of African-American men and women fought to integrate the military and wartime industry, and new civil rights organizations emerged during the war, promoting tactics that would propel the civil rights movements in the coming decades. All right. You guys got any questions?
Ken just asked, did CORE fade away or just join forces, I guess, integrate with one of the other organizations?
Basically, it fades away. I would say that by the time you get to late 60s, early 70s or so, CORE has faded away. I think that over the years, there's been kind of this push to recreate CORE, kind of like a second, another rendition of it or a second edition of CORE. But really, for the most part, its height is kind of in the late 40s, the early 50s. But its influence tends to wane by the time you get to the late 60s, early 70s.
The post is very informative to a lot of folks, and it was informative to me. I was a social studies teacher for 15 years prior to moving into administration. We'll wait. If no one else has any questions, I'd like to thank you for participating this morning.